Hey guys, Grandy Tamias here, and today I'm going to be giving my full, spoiler-filled review for Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. Boy, where do I start? I'm not going to give my number score out of 10 just yet, but based on the public consensus, the movie is alright. And I agree with that for the most part. I actually enjoyed it better on my second viewing. And I don't know what it was, but on my first viewing, I thought the pacing was weird. It felt less than 2 hours, but in reality it's 2 hours and 7 minutes. Maybe it was just that they didn't spend as long in New York as I thought they would. It's just, oh, now we're suddenly in Peru. If you're a Transformers fan, especially of the other movies, you are very likely to find some enjoyment out of this film. And even though there is some Beast Wars influence, I felt that was somewhat lacking. Which is ironic in two ways, because one, it's the title of the movie, and two, I said in my preconceptions that I was less interested in that, and more so in the G1 influence. I have since seen the rest of Beast Wars, and found it to be very satisfying. Maybe not as much as Prime or the pre-1986 movie seasons of G1, but still pretty good. Maybe they're saving more Beast Wars-inspired stories for future sequels, but I think they should have embraced it just a little more. At the very least, this would have been mitigated if Cheetor and Rhinox got more screen time. I think Cheetor only got like 4 or 5 lines in the entire film, and Rhinox might have had 1, if any at all. I'm not certain. I also would have liked it if, again, more Beast Wars characters were in it like Rat Trap, Dinobot, and Tigatron, but there was probably a limit on how many CGI characters they could render. This movie does confirm the existence of the Beast Wars Predacons with one of the insignias that Scourge collected, so again, that could be another thread for a future sequel. Which I hope they do. I would like to see Predacons like Waspinator, Pterosaur, Tarantulas, Black Arachnia, and of course the Beast Wars Megatron. I don't know if it has a name, but the planet that the Maximals came from looked really cool. At this point, it's standard in science fiction, so I'm not saying this as a complaint, but they do gloss over the fact that the planet has the same looking plants and landscape as Earth. In fact, very similar to the Peru locations they end up in later. They probably just didn't want to spend more time and money filming in another location for a scene that wasn't going to have human actors in it in the first place. And AirRaiser later implies that there are other Maximals who made it to Earth with them, but for whatever reason aren't around anymore by 1994. But the only other Maximal we see in the movie is Apelink, who I had never heard of before this movie. And when he appeared on screen and I noticed the pointed pieces on his face, I thought he was just a pre-Earth form for Optimus Primal, although I guess that assumption doesn't make sense because they already have their animal forms before they even get to Earth, which is another thing that science fiction, and especially Transformers, glosses over a lot. The part in the first trailer when Optimus Primal says the whole past and future thing doesn't get any further elaboration in the movie, so I'm uncertain how that fits in with the opening scene and what we can assume about the origins of the Maximals before that. So maybe I'll save it for a future video. Okay, moving on to the rest of the film, like I said, the humans were alright. Noah had some elements that felt pretty cliché, which on their own would have been fine if they had more depth. They say that he's ex-military, which is how a lot of human characters in Transformers get involved with the Cybertronian Wars, but it doesn't really factor into anything in Noah's case, other than maybe the final moment of the movie, which I'll get to later. Noah was shown tinkering with electronics like the cable box at the beginning of the movie, and he fixed up Mirage at the end, so it seemed like they were trying to play up some mechanical and engineering aspects to his character, similar to Cade Yeager or Charlie Watson. But mixed in with the ex-military thing, it seemed like the movie was struggling to decide what Noah was supposed to be. Of the two main human characters, I think I liked Elena more. Apparently I had mispronounced her name in previous videos. The archaeologist or some other person who stumbles on a Transformer relic is another cliché thing in this franchise, but I think it was used well in Elena's case. I like how they made her relevant with figuring out the passcode to shutting down the Transwarp key. Plus, I'm a sucker for ancient relic hunts like in Transformers Prime, as well as the idea of Transformers interacting with humans in ancient times. And that brings me to something that I think this movie does with human history that's actually better than most of the Bay movies. There's a joke in the movie where Elena is talking to Optimus Primal and says that she thinks the Nazca Lines and Tikal, no, not that one, but that does remind me, that one, may have had something to do with the Transformers as well. And Primal's like, no, we can't take credit for human ingenuity. It reminded me of that Futurama episode where they say that aliens were inspired by the ancient Egyptians as a reversal to the play on the common misconception that cultures hundreds or thousands of years ago could not have possibly constructed their monuments without the aid of some higher power. And this, of course, is the kind of thing that keeps my archaeology professor from community college up at night. While this movie does play around with ancient history, such as the Inca temple under the church holding the film's main relic, they never go as far as saying, oh, the Maximals built Machu Picchu. Granted, the Bay films didn't exactly do that either, but like with the Pyramid of Giza in Revenge of the Fallen, merely showing the Star Harvester buried underneath it kind of discredits how the ancient Egyptians were able to build the insides of the pyramids. While not known for sure, most experts hypothesize that a system of ramps were used to transport the sandstone blocks to the upper levels of the pyramid, but I'm getting off track. The film overall does a good job respecting Peruvian culture. Sure, there's a big festival with floats inspired by the Maximals, but the Transformers don't take credit for anything that's core to that culture in real life. Especially with how they depicted the Maximals coexisting with that Inca tribe. There were some other jokes I found really funny, like Optimus telling Bumblebee to stop going to drive-in movies, and the absolutely universe-breaking mention of Mark Wahlberg leaving the Funky Bunch to pursue acting, or it would be if this were still in the Bayverse, which it's not, because otherwise, it'd be so weird that no one called out how familiar Kate Yeager looks. There were some really crude jokes too, particularly from Mirage, but overall I thought he was a cool, if kind of ridiculous character. He got the most screen time out of all the Autobots, including Optimus Prime, and he reminds me a lot of other characters like Hot Rod and Transformers Prime Smokescreen. That's an archetype that this franchise cannot stop playing up for some reason. Mirage's transformation powers were perhaps the biggest surprise to me, especially in the final battle with how he was able to turn into Noah's exosuit. I genuinely thought he was going to die when Scourge shot him several times. I'm guessing maybe his spark chamber can shift around or something, which would explain how he survived and was able to be rebuilt later. And I complained how Mirage stole Jazz's vehicle mode, but he also stole Sunstreaker and Sideswipe's Lamborghini vehicle mode, and transformed into his classic Formula 1 car mode as a joke. And later he turns into a whole-ass garbage truck. Honestly, this movie is a little inconsistent with transformation powers compared to the Bumblebee movie, which also reminds me, Bee's off-road upgrades don't get any explanation. He's just able to spawn them when they're needed. It reminds me of how in G1 the Autobots were able to spawn hydrofoils whenever they needed to travel across water. Maybe B scanned off-road car parts prior to the film's events, but I thought this would have been a bigger deal and maybe a permanent change, or at least until he scans the new vehicle mode. Speaking of Bumblebee, I'm surprised that he's less involved in this film aside from his temporary death, again. In fact, his overall screen time is more comparable to that of RC and Wheeljack. I guess the filmmakers didn't think he needed as much screen time since he already got his own film. And I'm fine with that. I think it's good to see him as just a regular Autobot. He doesn't have to do every task for the team. Oh, and I did like how Optimus acknowledged Bumblebee's relationship with Charlie Watson. I'm surprised they brought in Stratosphere, who, prior to this movie, only existed in the Revenge of the Fallen toy line and the Dark of the Moon video game. And I think the only reason the filmmakers made him an elderly bot was because they didn't want him to fight and take on all the enemies by himself. Like, he's as big as a combiner, so if he were in his prime, not that kind of prime, he would have stomped on the Terraconza's army, hence why he only exists so that the plot can get them to Peru. Also, that moment where he transforms in the sky at the industrial yard should have easily been seen by New York civilians for miles around. In fact, you could probably say that about several moments in this movie. They make it seem like it's hard to keep up the robots in disguise aspect of this continuity, which is something that I like. RC I thought was really good. She easily has the best design and characterization we've seen out of all 3 live-action film appearances of her, and I hope that we get to see more of her in future sequels. I can't say the same for Wheeljack, though. I hope he stayed in Peru and we never see him again. He has brought dishonor to the name Wheeljack, and was unnecessarily changed from this far superior version of himself. In fact, that part when Battletrap runs him off the road and he flies straight into a rock had me cheering with joy on the inside. Ranting aside, Wheeljack really didn't do too much outside of the fight scenes. The most notable thing being his introduction where Noah assumed that he spoke Spanish and he took that as a racist insult. Probably a meta joke at how the Bay films had robot characters who were heavily inspired by racial stereotypes. Optimus Prime in this film was more violent than I was expecting. Maybe not as much as Bayformers 4 and 5, but he still fought very aggressively towards the Terrorcons, particularly Scourge. At one point he even says, "I can think of no better place to bury you," which I'll admit I thought was pretty badass. As always, Peter Cullen brings his A-game to this role, which is impressive when you consider that he isn't exactly playing the same Optimus Prime we've seen in the other movies and cartoons. Prime in this film, despite being on Earth for 7 years, is inexperienced with the planet, and laments the decisions that got him and the other Autobots there. And his arc where he learns to trust humans I thought was well executed. At first he doesn't like employing Noah's help to get into the museum, then later Optimus Primal teaches him about the Maximals' relationship with the Inca tribe, and finally he sees that Noah is willing to save him when he's about to be sucked up by Unicron. One interesting thing I learned is that there was originally going to be a scene involving Optimus Prime killing a Decepticon named Transit, which was cut from the film due to test audiences finding it too dark. In fact, this scene explains why Optimus Prime was in a bus yard when he sees the beacon from the Transwarp key, since Transit transforms into a bus and would have been hiding there. I understand cutting it because of how violent Optimus Prime already is, but it does seem like a missed opportunity to acknowledge the Decepticons, since they're otherwise not so much as mentioned at all in the finished film. Thankfully, the scene is planned to be on the home release once that comes out in a few months. Oh, and I forgot to mention Airazor in depth. I thought Michelle Yeoh did a great job conveying the wisdom and gravitas of the character, and it was pretty sad to see her slowly get corrupted with the Terrorcon rust and Optimus Primal having to kill her to save Elena. And again, it's a shame we never got to see Tigatron because I would have been interested to see how a relationship between him and Airazor would have turned out in this universe. Moving on to the Terrorcons, Battletrap and Nightbird suffered from the same sort of treatment as most of the Decepticons in the Bay films, especially the ones in The Last Knight. They have names and personalities, but their potential isn't used or they aren't integrated into the story the same way that Shatter and Dropkick were in the Bumblebee movie. Or going back to the 2007 film, Barricade wasn't the most fleshed out Decepticon, if any of them were, but he progressed the story by interacting directly with Sam and being the inciting reason he gets involved with the Autobots' conflict. Or Blackout, who didn't even speak, but had a sort of rivalry with Lennox and his team. I guess there kind of was a rivalry with the human characters and the two freezer drones, with Elena destroying one of them with a metal pipe and throwing it into the lava at the end of the film. They also reminded me of Frenzy in their design. Scourge was far more interesting, though. In fact, he might just be the best villain we've had in any live-action Transformers film. He's everything that Bayformers Megatron should have been, with the dash of the trophy-collecting obsession of Lockdown. As well as the multiple gadgets and hand attachments. My only major complaint with him is one that I also share with Lockdown. He was killed off too soon and too easily at that. Considering that Unicron is only subdued by the end of the film, with him being trapped in another galaxy, I think Scourge surviving would have been a nice way to keep that plot thread active before he returns, probably in the third installment of this new trilogy. And while not necessarily nitpicks, I do have a few other things about Scourge that I want to point out. First is that when he arrives on the Maximals' planet, he can be seen emerging from his pod, and you can see the smokestacks of his truck form, even though he hasn't visited Earth yet. But this is something that happened in the Bayformers movies too, like Sentinel Prime having his fire truck windows before scanning it. Scourge does mention Primus while fighting Optimus Prime at the museum, so I wonder how consistent that lore from other continuities is with this new timeline, and where it fits in with Unicron and the Matrix, which, as I predicted, was not brought up in this film, so we still don't know if Optimus has it. One piece of dialogue that got my attention was when Unicron was punishing Scourge for only getting half the key, he tells him, "I'll make you wish you had died on your home planet," or something along those lines. Which means that Unicron didn't create Scourge and probably the other Terrorcons too, but only recruited them as his heralds from one or more planets that he consumed. Again, this is another reason I wish Scourge had lived so that we could have learned more about that. Last thing I want to say about Scourge is that I felt the whole injured face reveal cliche wasn't necessary, especially since the movie doesn't give any backstory as to how he got that. Oh, and I guess for Unicron, no offense to whoever voiced him in this movie, but he does not hold a candle to Orson Welles. Typically with the character, most of us expect him to have a deeper voice, so it's something that's going to be hard to get used to if they keep this actor around for whenever Unicron appears next. Airazor also says that Unicron endowed the Terracons with dark power, but I'm not sure if that means that they all run on dark energon, which is more confusing since this Unicron eats worlds rich in regular energon. Speaking of which, in the Bumblebee movie, energon was green, while in this movie, it's blue like in most other media after Generation 1. Though I guess that could be explained with the fact that Optimus says that the rocks are raw energon, and so they haven't been refined yet, so maybe in their refined form, they take on a green color. Okay, now that I've covered all the characters and most of the story, there are two things left that I want to talk about. I alluded to it before, but this film references the classic Sonic the Hedgehog video games, with Noah and Chris using the codenames Sonic and Tails over a walkie-talkie. And later, Chris gives Mirage the codename Knuckles. And although Chris never saw them, I guess this analogy makes Scourge Dr. Robotnik and Unicron the Death Egg. I think that'd have made sense. Regardless, this reference was no doubt inspired by the success of the live-action Sonic movies, which, like the Transformers movies, are also made by Paramount. Maybe they'll bring things full circle and make a Transformers reference in Sonic Movie 3. Or I guess they already did, since in the first Sonic movie, Dr. Robotnik's truck is a highly modified Freightliner Argosy, and is actually the same prop used for Galvatron's vehicle mode in Transformers Age of Extinction. And finally, since everyone else has, I gotta mention the ending of this movie where Noah gets recruited for G.I. Joe. On a side note, I think in the background of the lab you can see one of the pods that the Terracons used to get to Earth. It probably got pulled up from the New York Bay off-screen during the movie's events. I'll confess, I am aware G.I. Joe has crossed over with Transformers several times in stuff like comics, but I'm otherwise unfamiliar with that franchise. It's just something that never interested me. I know that there were G.I. Joe movies around the same time as the first couple of Bayformers movies, but who knows if Paramount is going to be rebooting those or connecting them. Either way, I'm a little worried for this eventual crossover because it means I'd have to, at the very least, watch the original G.I. Joe cartoon, which is another show that my dad watched, but I don't know. No offense, but I don't see it. I mean, you give me the option between a franchise of two competing armies of alien robots that turn into vehicles versus two competing regular armies. The former is more likely to grab my attention. And yeah, Transformers team up with regular human armies all the time, but why G.I. Joe specifically? Who knows, maybe someone can change my mind. Hey, if the MCU can have Captain America fight alongside Thor in the Guardians of the Galaxy, maybe there's something to the idea of the Autobots needing help from G.I. Joe. Anyway, that's everything I have to say about Rise of the Beasts. Overall, I can see why a lot of people might have issues with this movie, but I've been enjoying it a lot more after my second viewing, and thinking about it, I might even see it a third time. I'm tossing between a 7 and a 7.5 out of 10. I hope we get more news on the next Transformers film soon, because I am really curious to see where they take that Unicron plot thread and what new characters they could introduce. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you thought of Transformers Rise of the Beasts. Be sure to check out my previous Transformers videos if you haven't, and I'm open to suggestions if you want me to talk more in depth about this or the other films. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.